On April 10th, 2026, four human beings strapped themselves into a titanium-lined capsule and gambled their lives on a piece of hardware that NASA already knew was broken. While the world watched the triumph of the Artemis II splashdown, they weren't seeing a victory of modern science. They were seeing the end result of a multi-billion-dollar game of Russian roulette. We've been told that Artemis is the safe version of the moon landing. We've been told that because we have 5G supercomputers and advanced AI, the cowboy era of the 1960s is over, that we have managed the risk of spaceflight into extinction. That is a lie. The four astronauts, Commander Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, didn't survive because of NASA's brilliance. They survived because they got lucky. They were sent into an 18,000-degree inferno with a heat shield that NASA watched literally explode during its last test flight. Tonight, we aren't looking at the PR footage. We are peeling back the curtain on the institutional rot that allowed this mission to fly. We're going to talk about the normalization of deviance, the silencing of whistleblowers, and the terrifying truth about the 13 minutes and 36 seconds of fire that almost turned a trillion-dollar program into a national tragedy. Why did NASA gamble 4 lives on a heat shield they knew was defective? Let's find out. To understand why the heat shield on Artemis was a death trap, we first have to understand what we lost in the 50 years since we last stepped on the moon. In the 1960s, the engineers didn't have inherited confidence. They were terrified. They knew that when a capsule hits the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour, the air doesn't just get hot. It turns into a non-equilibrium plasma. It reaches 18,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is twice the temperature of the surface of the sun. The Apollo solution was a material called Avcoat, an epoxy novolac resin. But it wasn't just the chemistry that mattered. It was the architecture. The Apollo shield was built as a massive, hand-filled honeycomb of 300,000 individual cells. Every single one of those 300,000 cells was hand-filled by a technician using what was essentially a caulking gun. It was a messy, grueling, incredibly expensive process. But it had one feature that was mission-critical. It was permeable. When the heat turns the outer layer of the shield into gas, those gases need an escape route. In the Apollo honeycomb, the tiny gaps between those 300,000 cells acted like microvents. The shield could breathe. Because the gas could escape, pressure never built up behind the material. The shield wore down smoothly, like an eraser on paper. Fast forward to the Artemis program. NASA and Lockheed Martin decided they could do it better. They wanted a 21st century manufacturing process. They moved away from the 300,000 tiny cells to roughly 180 large prefabricated blocks of Avcoat. On a spreadsheet, this was a revolution. It reduced labor by 80%. It was lean. It was efficient. But in their quest for efficiency, they committed the ultimate sin of engineering. They optimized for the factory floor instead of the fireball. By creating large, dense blocks, they removed the breathing room. They turned a heat shield into a pressure cooker. They prioritized a modern manufacturing process over the fundamental laws of gas expansion. This is the part of the story that should make you want to throw your phone across the room. In December 2022, the uncrewed Artemis I mission returned from the moon. On the surface, it was a triumph. The media called it flawless. But when the capsule was hauled into a high-security hangar at Kennedy Space Center, the engineers didn't see a triumph. They saw a warning from the grave. The heat shield had liberated. That is NASA's clinical bureaucratic term for it, exploded. Large chunks of the Avcoat, some the size of dinner plates, had cracked off during re-entry. There were deep divots, pockmarks, and spallation that the computer models said were mathematically impossible. The computer models, the multi-million-dollar simulations NASA used to guarantee safety, predicted a smooth, even ablation. The reality was a charred, crumbling wreck. If you are a sane organization, you stop, you ground the program. You go back to the drawing board and fix the fundamental flaw in the block design. But NASA was in a corner. The SLS rocket was costing $2 billion per launch. The political pressure to get Americans around the moon by 2026 was immense. So what did NASA do? We're tracking every update on the Artemis III redesign. Subscribe to stay informed on the real status of the moon landing. They didn't fix the shield. Instead, they decided to manage the defect. An internal report from the Office of Inspector General eventually revealed the terrifying truth. The prefabricated blocks were too dense. The gases created during reentry couldn't vent, so they built up pressure behind the outer layer until the shield literally shattered from the inside out. NASA leadership looked at a shield that was literally falling apart and said, well, the capsule didn't melt, so we have enough margin to put humans on the next one. This is the exact same normalization of deviance that killed the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger. They saw foam falling off for years, and because it hadn't killed anyone yet, they decided it was a characteristic of the system rather than a defect. Now, I want to tell you something that is genuinely sickening. When NASA went to manufacture the heat shield for Artemis II, the mission with the 4 human beings, they didn't go back to the old, safe Apollo design. In fact, they made the Artemis II shield even denser than the one that failed on Artemis I. Why? Because it made their X-ray and ultrasonic inspections easier. They prioritized the quality control checklist over the physics of survival. They wanted a material that was easy for their robots to scan so they could verify there were no cracks in the factory. But by making the material denser for the sake of an inspection, they made it more likely to crack during re-entry. They were inspecting for perfection on the ground while building a death trap for the sky. When engineers raised concerns, they were met with the sunk cost fallacy. Billions had been spent. The SLS rocket was on the pad. The Moonjoy PR campaign was in full swing. To admit the heat shield was a failure was to admit the entire Artemis architecture was a failure. They ran unvalidated computer simulations. They used small-scale tests, samples only 2 inches wide, to prove that a 16-foot wide shield would be safe. It's like testing a single brick and claiming you know exactly how a skyscraper will collapse. It was a total abandonment of the scientific method in favor of a political schedule. When you have a piece of hardware that you know is broken, but you refuse to fix it, you have to find a workaround. NASA's workaround for the April 2026 mission sounds like something out of a sci-fi thriller, but it was terrifyingly real. Usually, a lunar return uses a skip re-entry. It's a brilliant piece of orbital mechanics where the capsule hits the atmosphere, bounces back up into space to shed speed, and then dives back in for the final descent. But NASA's investigation into the Artemis I failure found something terrifying. The skip was exactly when the shield was most likely to fail. During that brief moment in the vacuum between dips, the outer layer of the shield would cool down and seal up. Then when it hit the atmosphere the second time, the trapped gases would expand and blow the shield apart. So, what was NASA's fix? They decided to skip the skip. They forced the Artemis II crew to ride a shallower, hotter, more punishing trajectory for a continuous 13 minutes. They were banking on the idea that if they kept the shield white-hot, the material would stay soft and permeable, enough to vent the gas. Think about the insanity of that. You are using the very fire that is trying to incinerate the astronauts as a safety valve because you were too cheap or too rushed to fix the hardware on the ground. By flying this hotter path, they subjected the crew to higher sustained G-forces, nearly 4 Gs. They also stripped away their landing margin. If the capsule had encountered bad weather at the splashdown site, they had almost no ability to steer to a different location. They had removed the safety buffers to compensate for a manufacturing defect. This wasn't engineering. This was a Hail Mary pass at 25,000 miles per hour. Not everyone at NASA was a silent accomplice. There are still people inside the agency who remember what it feels like to lose a crew. Charles Camarda is one of them, a veteran astronaut who flew on the first mission after the Columbia disaster. Camarda is arguably the world's leading expert on thermal protection systems. He was the conscience of the heat shield board, and he was screaming from the rooftops. Camarda walked into the safety briefings in January 2026 and told the leadership exactly what they didn't want to hear. The models are unvalidated. The risk is unquantified. We are repeating the mistakes of the past. He pointed out that NASA was using managerial logic to solve an engineering problem. In NASA's world, if you can't prove something is unsafe, you declare it safe. But in the world of physics, if you can't prove something is safe, it is deadly. Camarda was marginalized. He was sidelined. His reports were noted and then buried under a mountain of bureaucratic action items. Why? Because Charles Camarda was an obstacle to a press release. He was a delay in a world that only valued speed. NASA had become so obsessed with returning to the moon that they had forgotten that the goal isn't just to get there, it's to come back alive. April 10th, 2026, 7:53 p.m. Eastern Time. The Orion capsule, traveling at 24,661 miles per hour, hits the entry interface. This is the blackout. For 6 minutes, the heat is so intense, it creates an electrically charged shield around the capsule that blocks all radio waves. There is no voice from the crew. There is no data from the computers. Inside the cabin, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen are feeling the weight of 4 Gs pushing them into their seats. Outside the window, the sky has turned into a wall of white-hot plasma. In mission control, the lead flight director later admitted he felt a sense of dread. In the viewing room, the families of the astronauts sat in a silence that felt like an eternity. Inside that plasma bubble, the heat shield was experiencing its modified trajectory. The avcoat was glowing white. The internal gases were screaming to get out. Because of the shortened skip, the shield was hotter than any shield has ever been in human history. If a single chunk of that material, the size of a dinner plate, had liberated like it did on Artemis I, it could have struck the parachute bay. It could have exposed the aluminum structure to a plasma jet that would cut through it like a blowtorch through butter. For 6 minutes, the 4 most famous people on Earth were falling through fire alone, hoping that the modified trajectory was enough to keep the deviant heat shield from shattering. NASA played Russian roulette with 4 human lives, and they didn't tell the public until after the trigger was pulled. At 8:07 p.m., the radio crackled. "Houston, Orion, all 4 crew are doing well." The splashdown was a bullseye. The Navy recovered the capsule. The astronauts were hailed as heroes. The media went into a frenzy, talking about the Artemis generation and the new era of space. But as the capsule was hoisted onto the deck of the USS John P. Murtha, the cameras caught a glimpse of the shield. The damage was there. The char loss was visible on the shoulder. There was a visible, unusual white mark along the edge of the shield. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman was quick to dismiss it. "No chunks missing," he told the press. "The shield performed as expected." But as expected is a very slippery phrase when your expectations have already been lowered to accommodate a defect. The truth is, the shield didn't work because of the design. It survived because of the desperate last-minute trajectory changes NASA made to avoid the shield's own internal pressure. And here is the final proof that NASA knows they screwed up. They are completely redesigning the shield for Artemis III. They aren't tweaking it. They are ripping out the block design and going back to a more permeable formulation. They are admitting, without saying the words, that Artemis II was a mission that should never have flown. They are fixing it now because they know they can't get away with it a second time. Success is not the same as safety. If you play Russian roulette and the hammer hits an empty chamber, it doesn't mean you made a smart decision. It means you got lucky. Why did we take this risk? Why did we gamble with the lives of people who are essentially the front men for a massive taxpayer-funded PR stunt? Is it because we're bold? Is it because we're explorers? No, it's because of a calendar. NASA is terrified of the gap. They are terrified of China beating them to the South Pole of the moon. They are terrified of losing their funding if they don't show progress. We have reached a point in our civilization where the image of success is more important than the reality of safety. This is the normalization of deviance at its most lethal. It's a slow, creeping rot. It starts with a small defect, a piece of foam, an O-ring, a heat shield block, and it ends with a flag being flown at half-mast. We look back at Apollo 11 as the ultimate gamble. We see Armstrong dodging boulders, and we think, that was the peak of danger. But Armstrong's danger was the danger of a pioneer. He knew the risks, and his hardware was built to the highest possible standard of the time. Artemis II's danger was the danger of a bureaucrat. It was the danger of a known defect being managed by people who were more afraid of a scheduled delay than a catastrophic failure. The four sols of Artemis II are home because the physics of the atmosphere happened to cooperate with the flawed math of the engineers. But the moon is a harsh mistress. She doesn't care about your deadlines. She doesn't care about your PR. And eventually, luck runs out. Apollo 11 was built by people who knew they were amateurs, so they acted like professionals. Artemis was built by people who think they are professionals, but acted like amateurs. We are going back to the moon, but we are going back on a foundation of managed risks and political expediency. We need to hold these agencies accountable. We need to stop pretending that workarounds are the same as solutions. We need to listen to the Charles Camardis of the world before the radio goes silent and never comes back. The Artemis generation deserves more than a gamble. They deserve a spacecraft that breathes. They deserve a NASA that cares more about the crew than the calendar. Thanks for watching, and if you think NASA is being reckless with our astronauts, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next one.